Okay, it looks like we are live. My name is Pastor Park Hunter. I am the interim coordinator of the Interfaith Leaders Coalition. And on behalf of the Interfaith Leaders Coalition, I want to welcome you today to our community conversations, which are co-hosted with English Lutheran Church. And we're very grateful to them for their support and the technical assistance today. Community conversations are intended to be meaningful and thoughtful discussions about important local topics, often with a faith-based perspective or angle brought in. And today we're going to be talking about social distance, how COVID has revealed the economic gaps between us here in the La Crosse area. And I think we all recognize the health and economic problems of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we may not realize how it has pushed so many people and families in our area who have been on the brink kind of into the crisis mode. And likewise, a lot of the nonprofits and organizations which have existed for years to help those folks in need now find themselves struggling as well. There will be an audio recording of today's presentation that's going to be available at interfaithleaders.org. And this video itself will stay online on the English Lutheran YouTube channel. If you have questions today, you're welcome to post them in the YouTube chat. If you're watching this on YouTube live and you have a Gmail account, you should be able to post questions in the chat. And at the end of the presentation, I'll share those with our panelists. Just so you're aware, upcoming conversations on February the 17th, we're going to be talking about connecting, stories of faith and fellowship, and especially how those are helping us through this time when there's a lot of isolation. And the following month, we're going to be discussing what we've learned and talking with the local school superintendents about how education has had to adapt during this time. And then our April conversation will be on how climate change is affecting the Cooley region. So I want to thank you again for coming. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Brian Searle from Congregation Sons of Abraham, who has an opening prayer for us.
Thank you, Pastor. If we could advance to the prayer. A prayer for our troubled time. In your name we pray. Our God, merciful and compassionate, as you've always shown yourself to be. In this dangerous time, we pray to you. Grant us the strength we will need to bring us in health of body and mind to better, safer days. Grant to those who now work tirelessly to stem the tide of illness and death the knowledge they need to swiftly succeed in their sacred task. Grant to those who put their own lives at risk to care for and save others the endless compassion, patience, and resolve they will need, and keep them and their loved ones from all harm. Grant to our leaders here in our Cooley region, in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and our entire country, the wisdom and understanding required to avert future calamities of whatever magnitude. In your abundant mercy, grant ample health-giving sustenance to all who suffer hardships and deprivations because of loss of income or lack of sources of food or lack of vital resources of any kind. May America remain loyal to the principles of the Declaration of Independence and apply them to ever-widening areas of life. May our country be free from oppression, persecution, and unjust discrimination, and may we overcome religious, racial, and class conflicts. And may we be restored as a haven of refuge for the victims of injustice and deprivation.
Thank you very much.
Oh, that's not done.
Sorry.
Sorry. May we learn the art of living together and come to understand how to appreciate differences, to reconcile clashing interests, and to help one another achieve a harmonious and abundant life. May we acquire the wisdom to choose honest and capable leaders who will govern us by democratic and ethical principles. And may the enterprise of our American people be blessed, that we may utilize the resources of our land for the good of all the world. Help us, O God, strengthen the goodness and the humanity within all of us. Help us to treasure and focus on what is worthwhile in our lives. Help us to see beyond this pandemic to a brighter future for us and all humankind. And let us say, Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. So I want to introduce our panelists today who are going to be talking about our topic, how COVID is revealing the economic gaps between us. And we're really blessed with an all-star panel of local leaders. Mary Kay Wolf is the executive director of the Great Rivers United Way. And previously she was the director of the YWCA and worked at Family and Children's Center. And her focus at the United Way is on collaboration, facilitation, fundraising, and outcome-based programming. Great Rivers United Way is based here in La Crosse, and you serve 7 counties in the region. And then Hetty Brown is the executive director of Coulee Cap Incorporated, which is a community action program serving Crawford, La Crosse, Monroe, and Vernon counties. And in her role, she oversees more than 20 programs and 50 federal, state, and private grants to address the causes and conditions of poverty. And Hetty is a passionate advocate for economic equality in our community. Jamie Schlegel is executive director of the La Crosse Community Foundation. She originally joined the foundation in August 2016 as its program director, and her work has been attributed to millions of dollars in philanthropic gifts for charitable organizations in the La Crosse area. Thank you very much to you for all 3 of you for joining us today, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to share.
Thanks, Park, for that introduction. This is Mary Kay Wolf, and I am going to start us off today. So if you look at our agenda for today, just to be very formal, I'm going to talk about the ALICE report, which is it's data, but don't be scared. It's not a lot of data, and it's pre-pandemic data, which is very important to remember as we go through it. But basically, this is the why. Why did we go from one thing to crisis in general? And then Hetty is going to talk about the face of that crisis in terms of a real life struggle. And then Jamie will wrap us up with the helpers and the hope as she talks a little bit about the nonprofit community that we all know and love, right? So if I get started here, I'm going to talk a little bit, well, this is what I'm going to talk about basically is ALICE, asset limited, income constrained, and employed. That's a mouthful, so I'll explain to you what ALICE is and the ALICE threshold. I'll also go over a household survival budget. Was really important for you to understand where things were. And then just some really brief workforce trends in terms of where does ALICE work and what are the true opportunities for somebody who is ALICE. Now, if you are a data geek and what I'm providing you today isn't enough to satisfy that need, and trust me, it won't be, you can go to our website and look up the ALICE report, because this is an entire report that is commissioned by the United Ways of Wisconsin, and it's every 2 years. So the data I'm going to go over is from 2018 for the most part. So let's talk about what the definition of ALICE really is. And basically, this is someone whose income falls above the poverty level, above the federal poverty level, but below a basic survival budget. So in short, they make enough money to not qualify for most government programming, but they make too much money to actually pay everything that they need to pay. So if we back up just quickly, the La Crosse County Snapshot here covers, obviously, La Crosse County. So this is, again, 2018, so pre-pandemic. So when you look at what the unemployment rate was in 2018, that's not what it is now. So also, though, the key thing to remember is the number of ALICE threshold households in La Crosse County was 26%, a little bit higher than the state average. The number of households in poverty was 11%. So as we go through, the 37% of people who live at the ALICE threshold or below is what the figure you want to remember. So let's dig a little bit deeper into La Crosse County and look at the actual communities in La Crosse County and where the statistics lie there. So you can kind of peruse and see what community you're most interested. The one I will point out, though, is the city of La Crosse. In 2018, 50% of the households in the city of La Crosse lived at the ALICE threshold or below. So just take that in. Half the households in the city of La Crosse can't make ends meet. So as we go on, we're going to look at what that household survival budget really means. So we're going to look at these categories, and I want you to know how the numbers were arrived at. So when you look at housing, you're talking about the HUD's fair market value. So basically that's the Housing and Urban Development fair market value. That's a government entity. Child care costs will be considered from a certified family child care home. This isn't a licensed child care center. This is certified child care, and there is a difference. Food will be at the lowest level of the USDA plan. So we're not extravagant here. This is just bare bones. Transportation is defined by gas and maintenance, not a car payment. So then when we move to healthcare, we're talking about nominal out-of-pocket costs. This is not a chronic illness household. This is not somebody who experienced a trauma in healthcare. This is just a healthy household out-of-pocket costs. Then technology is defined by a smartphone. And let's face it, smartphones are the mode of communication for humans in our world today. So this is a communication need. It doesn't cover laptops. It doesn't cover tablets. It doesn't cover anything like that. This is just a way of communicating with other humans. And then there's a miscellaneous of 10% that we all have in our household budget. So what does that mean? What are the numbers here, what we're talking about? So a survival budget in La Crosse County for 2018 looked like this. For a single adult versus a household of 4, where there were 2 adults in it, and a small child in preschool and then an infant. So if you look at these categories that we just defined, this is as bare as it gets. I would challenge anyone after this presentation to do a search on the internet for a safe and affordable housing at $587 a month. This covers numbers. These are numbers here. This doesn't even cover access. So when you look at the child care costs for 2 children, that might be about as bare bones as you can get. But right now, the access to child care is very, very low. So again, these are just numbers. When you get to the bottom line, it tells you what the annual total needs to be in order to survive a survival budget or to live a survival budget. As a single adult, you need to make, and I'll go to hourly, right? You need to make $11.42 an hour to meet this survival budget. As a family of 4, the household needs to bring in $36.46 an hour. Now, what's telling more than anything is what's not included in this budget. There's no entertainment in this budget. There's no savings. There's no bootstraps in this budget. You know, the famous savings of pull yourself up by your bootstrap. There's nothing in this budget that implies there's any bootstraps there. So what we have defined for this category of people is they are one tragedy away from falling into poverty or falling into a crisis. And I think that we can all agree that this pandemic has been one tragedy for so many people. Remember those hourly wages as we move along here, because it's important to understand as we go forward. So our next slide is just a really quick snapshot of what that job opportunity is for people who live in the ALICE category. When you look at that top pyramid, this is innovators, right? This is people who use their brains to move us forward in our society, right? Most of these jobs, inventors and adapters, in fact, none of these jobs in the state of Wisconsin pay less than $20 an hour. When you get down into the pyramid, you're looking at what we call maintainers. These are our ALICE population. They work at the jobs that maintain our society. They're the nurturers, they're the infrastructure workers. These are the ones that keep us functioning. So 62% of those jobs in that nurturer category in the state of Wisconsin pay less than $20 an hour. And then 63% in the state of Wisconsin pay less than $20 an hour for those who work within the infrastructure of keeping our society moving. Our next slide is a little bit about what those jobs actually pay. This is kind of eye-opening for people that might not work in that industry or are far removed from that industry to understand what we're really talking about. So if you look at the maintainer category of the ALICE worker, they care for the workforce, they maintain the infrastructure, and yet in 2018 in La Crosse County, only one of the top 20 occupations paid enough to help family of four survive in that household. So these are the top occupations in La Crosse County, meaning the most jobs that we have in La Crosse County available to all of us is retail. The next job, the most jobs we have to offer to people for work is registered nurses, which is great because that's a good hourly wage. But when you look at that hourly wage, keep in mind, if you're a single parent with 2 children, that hourly wage is not enough to sustain a household based on our numbers of hourly wages back in our survival budget. So that's just a really quick look at the number of job opportunities that pay that wage that makes that household survive, but again, not thrive. So this next slide it's a little busy, so let me explain it to you really quickly. The red portion, and I have to apologize, this is from 2016, but I could not find a pertinent 2018 data for you. My guess is that the numbers are not terribly different. So when we talked about a survival budget, we talked about housing, childcare, food, and transportation. That's what's listed there. The red portion is the income of that ALICE worker. The orange category is the ALICE income. So you've got, sorry, I said that backwards. The red section is the cost of those housing, childcare, food, and transportation. The orange category is the income of that worker. The yellow part is there are some government programs, but mostly nonprofits that try to help. How are we doing as a community, right? Bringing help. And the gap shows us that there's this huge gap of actually being able to make it work. But I will say the food category, we're doing a pretty good job. We're feeding folks, and there's only a 20% gap in comparison to the 47% gap or the 53% gap. We're doing a good job feeding people. The gap, however, in all these categories can really be defined as the cycle. This is the cycle that keeps people from being able to move economically or have that economic mobility to move out of the ALICE threshold or to move out of poverty. This is what keeps people back. So that's my data presentation, and it's not very exciting and it's a little depressing, but I think it was important for you to see. So then the next presenter is Hetty Brown from Cooley CAP. As introduced, Hetty's the executive director of Cooley CAP, and she's going to bring to you a face of what this looks like. And so I'll turn it over to Hetty.
Thank you very much, Mary Kay, for that presentation. And I have to say, I really appreciate the Great Rivers United Way and the United Way organization, because we use this ALICE data all the time to do our work at Cooley CAP. Which you heard in the beginning, we work as a community action agency to develop programs and services to fight poverty, to help people in this situation. But we also work to change the very systems that are in place that create the situation in the first place. So we use the ALICE data quite a bit to address these issues. And in our 55 years of experience at Cooley CAP doing that, we've encountered a number of community economic emergencies. And whether that emergency has been created because of a man-made disaster such as a banking crisis, or a natural disaster such as a flood, or now a pandemic, the impact on those who are already struggling to make ends meet seem to follow a similar pattern. Wealth and income disparities that existed before the crisis grow even larger through the crisis. And without cash, people who are already struggling to make ends meet find it even harder to recover after the crisis, even after the larger economy recovers. So today I want to share with you a story about someone we recently worked with at CooleyCap. But her story is representative of hundreds of people who have come to us for assistance through this pandemic. And I also want to show you how her household and other similar households have weathered the crisis once unemployment benefits and other stimulus money have started to kick in. Next slide, please. So let's start with Jana's story. Of course, I've changed her name to protect her privacy, but Jana is a resident of La Crosse County who, until the pandemic, worked full-time in the service industry, and actually one of the jobs that Mary Kay talked about as one of our community maintainers. She was suddenly laid off in March, and since returning to work in mid-May, she's only been given part-time hours that changes, and her schedule changes from week to week. Her changing schedule has made things really difficult for finding childcare, which is actually a new need now that her children are attending school from home, but are not old enough to be left alone. She pays friends and family members to stay with them while she works. Since her kids are at home every day now, she noticed that things are becoming more expensive. Her food costs have really gone up. They used to eat many of their meals at school. She has noticed her electric bill has also gone way up, and she even noticed that her water bill was higher on her last statement. All of her other living expenses have not gone down. She still needs gas to get to work, and she still has to pay rent and car insurance. She has to buy medication and other basic necessities for her household. She applied for unemployment benefits online in March and didn't hear anything right away. She tried to call and call and call, but she couldn't get through right away. She did receive a stimulus check in April, so she was able to get caught up on April's rent and past due bills. All had late fees, so she was able to pay those as well. In May, she finally received unemployment for the first time. She'd been laid off, and with that money, she was able to get caught up on some other past due bills, as well as her rent for May, less all the late fees that she had incurred. She also applied for unemployment for the hours she lost when only being called back part-time, but the unemployment office said her schedule is based on employer need, which may disqualify her. So even though she worked a steady full-time schedule before and her hours were only lost because of the pandemic, she may not get unemployment benefits for the hours she lost since going back part-time. She receives food share benefits, but that does not cover the increased food costs. So she visits local food pantries, for which she's tremendously grateful. She hasn't been able to pay June or July's rent. She received a 5-day pay or vacate notice from her landlord. Here's some of the comments that we heard from Jana when we were working with her. It's so hard to keep track of where to go to for help. So many places are closed because of COVID. I try to call around on my days off in between doing laundry and helping the kids with homework. I'd like to look for a new job, but who has the time? I have to call the unemployment office. They don't understand my situation, and I'm always on hold for so long. Every program requires so much paperwork. People are really nice and helpful, but it's overwhelming. Jana says she feels exhausted. One day, as Jana started a phone meeting with a case manager to get rental and utility bill assistance, her phone died. It had been disconnected because of a past due bill. When my phone died, I thought, I'm done. I just can't do this anymore. Now, the good news is that we were able to help Jana. We used the Wisconsin Rental Assistance Program to help pay her rent for June, July, and August. And we used a local grant from the La Crosse Community Foundation. We used a grant from the La Crosse Community Foundation and the Great Rivers United Way Emergency Fund to help pay her phone bill and her utility bill, as well as help her make a small car repair so that she could drive to work. Our case managers have also stayed in touch with her to make sure that she's still okay and getting the referrals that she needs. But Jana is just like a lot of other people that we've been helping. Next slide. A 2019 study by the Federal Reserve actually showed that 40% of Americans could not come up with only $400 to cover an emergency, and that was actually before the pandemic started. And when the pandemic did hit early on, the unemployment office saw a massive number of people that needed help. In fact, 800,000 unemployment claims were filed just between March 15th and July 15th, and 40% of those claims were made by people making less than $40,000 a year. And claims remained high. Through November 7th of 2020, over 500,000 people filed for unemployment in Wisconsin. But there's hope, right? There's been a lot of federal stimulus money that has been passed and handed to the state. State unemployment offices are here to help, and state unemployment benefits have come down. There's been a lot of community support. So let's now take some time to see how that type of assistance might help a family like Jana's. Okay, so just to set this slide up a little bit. So let's look at a family. This assumes an adult, an adult that worked full-time at that survival wage, that adult survival wage that Mary Kay talked about earlier, $11.42 an hour. Let's start there. And this person has 2 children. And they've been unemployed during the 2020 pandemic months of March through December. So it's a 10-month period of time. Now we're going to look at their cost of living during that 10-month period of unemployment, assuming they worked full-time before at $11.42 an hour. So if we looked at the fair market rental rate for a 2-bedroom apartment, you can see the rent that they would have owed during that time period. Now, this assumes that this person is a renter, not a mortgage holder. If they were a mortgage holder, they would have mortgage, plus they would have property taxes. So that's an added expense that's not covered here. But a renter would have owed this amount, plus utility, average utility and water costs. You can also see some of the other basic costs that Mary Kay outlined in that Alice budget, assuming this person's laid off. So like childcare isn't on here if they're not working, but some of the other costs in food and gasoline for the car, because you still have to run, errands and healthcare and so forth. And you can see that during that 10-month period of time for these basic costs, you can see a family's budget would still have to be over $27,000. Now let's look at what stimulus benefits or unemployment benefits that same household at that full-time wage before would have been qualified for. The stimulus payment in April would have been $1,200 plus $500 for each child. That's $1,300. There was a federal stimulus package of unemployment, which was $600 a week, eligible from April 4th to the July 25th. That would have been $9,600. And then at a wage of $11.42 an hour, base employment at the state unemployment equation that they use, plus some supplemental state unemployment benefits that came with additional stimulus. If this worker got the full benefits that they would have been owed during that time period, the full state unemployment benefits they would have qualified for is over $8,900. Now you can see here how much they would have gotten if they got full benefits versus how much that they needed to pay in bills. And you can see it's a big gap already. Now, let's add in some of those other costs that we deem as also necessary expenses, like internet so their children can attend school and maybe some school supplies, laundry and cleaning supplies, and maybe personal protective equipment, child care if the parent does need to run errands or look for a job, clothing. If your child has a birthday, you want to celebrate, toiletries, feminine hygiene projects, and other unexpected expenses. You can see here how a family can quickly fall behind. And I got to say, this assumes the best case scenario. This assumes the family is already making ends meet before their crisis hits. And as we heard from Mary Kay's presentation, many families are not already on a sound financial footing. In fact, Many are not. 26% of people are not making ends meet or hitting that Alice budget. This scenario assumes that their cost of living is already affordable, when in fact, many families are struggling with costs, and housing is one of the big pieces that they struggle with. About a quarter of low-income households are considered housing cost burdened, and that jumps to about 72% of low-income houses. Very low-income houses are considered housing cost burden, which means that they pay a significant portion of their income on housing and utilities, leaving less income for other necessary expenses. So the question always comes up like, well, why don't they find cheaper housing? Well, as Mary Kay pointed out, there just isn't any. There was a report published by the city of La Crosse County, and Monroe County in 2019 that looked at the impediments to fair housing in the area. And it found that 37% of households in this area had one of 4 housing problems. They were cost burdened, overcrowded, or they lacked complete kitchen or plumbing facilities. So affordable and decent housing accessibility is a huge problem for our area. The scenario I showed you also assumes that someone's making over $11 an hour and working full time. In fact, minimum wage in our area, in our state, is only $7.25 an hour, and many adults are only making minimum wage. More than half of minimum wage workers are adults between the ages of 25 and 54, and 60% of them work full time. Wisconsin is unlike 29 other states who have raised their minimum wage. Minnesota, Michigan, and even Illinois all around us have all raised their minimum wage. Wisconsin has not. So a large percentage of the adult population is still making minimum wage. That scenario I showed you assumes someone made over $11 an hour. The scenario I showed you also assumes that unemployment benefits was equally distributed over that 10-month period of time. But in fact, not all months are created equally when it comes to unemployment benefits. In Jana's situation, when she was getting state unemployment and maybe some federal unemployment benefits through the stimulus package, she may have made $3,300 a month to cover her bills. When the federal stimulus went away in July, so in August, September, October, if she was unemployed, that would have dropped down to state benefits of a little over $900 a month for her wage. That isn't even enough to cover her rent and utilities for 1 month. The scenario I showed you also assumes that this person was a regular employee, not a self-employed person, not a small business owner, not a contractor, and not a migrant worker, even a migrant worker here legally. Many times these workers are not eligible for any benefits, state unemployment benefits or otherwise. And finally, the scenario I shared with you assumes that the person was eligible to receive 100% of full benefits. There are many loopholes and possible scenarios in which a person may be denied a benefit. As you heard in Jana's situation, where she was full-time before the pandemic and now only part-time, but yet the unemployment office was not giving her unemployment for those lost hours. So there's a lot of situations in which you can see it's very easy for a working family to fall behind. And now is the time to address these gaps. That these gaps were not necessarily created by this pandemic. These are systemic issues that were here before the pandemic. But it's certainly a good time for us to take a bigger look at them as a we are here together today to hear and to discuss and to consider these issues. And we can look at policy changes. We can look at community changes that we can make to not only help our neighbors through this current crisis, but to strengthen our social framework so that we can be more resilient in the future. And now I'm very happy, next slide, to introduce Jamie Schloegel of the La Crosse Community Foundation. She's the Executive Director of the La Crosse Community Foundation. So she can discuss the helpers and the hope, the very system in place that's called upon to provide the support that people rely on in times of need. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Hetty. So I wish that my news was going to be a positive burst of energy here, but it's going to get more depressing before it gets better. The three of us, though, made a commitment when we put together this presentation that we have a lot of great things going in our community, and there is hope. We have hope for how La Crosse can be a vibrant, wonderful place for everybody to call home. And so I'm gonna dig into a little bit more of the details around how nonprofits fit into this puzzle. Hetty explained very well how the government assistance came into play for those who were struggling economically before and now during the pandemic. And so when we look at how our, you can go ahead, Parker, and click them all in there. Thank you. We can see how government assistance didn't fill all of the gaps for Jana. And as a society, the way that we've built our government platforms, it's not necessarily intended to. That's where the nonprofit sector comes in. A lot of people don't know that that's actually how the charitable tax deduction comes into play. It's as members of our country, we choose to support nonprofits to fill in the gaps to help meet those needs. And we get a charitable tax deduction for doing that in lieu of paying more in taxes for a more federal or government response. And this is a good thing for the most part because local funding equals flexibility. Not every community, not every household needs the same thing. There can't be a lot of times uniform policies and services and programs that are going to address the very unique needs of every individual person and household. And so we're incredibly fortunate here in La Crosse County, especially, to have a community foundation, to have United Way, to have a deep, deep sense of a culture of philanthropy where people want to give to help their neighbors. And so we have the flexibility here in the community for our nonprofit organizations to be able to step up and help fill these gaps. And one more thing too, I think this is huge, is when we have nonprofits who are helping, especially to provide social services, as it allows for more individualized, dignified services. People can be people. They're not just a number. You can go ahead and advance, right? So, you know, as I was preparing this presentation and you know, Mary Kay started out her part of this presentation today on the Alice households, we've certainly learned something here as local funders on what was already happening in our nonprofit sector before the pandemic hit. And we saw our nonprofits as time went out fall somewhere along this continuum. You'll see on the far left side, we have frontline nonprofits, those who are working direct service to individuals to help them meet their basic needs. And then we saw other nonprofits who had to pause for a little bit, to go dormant. Their need maybe wasn't as effective or needed during this time. So you can see that graphic there says advanced thumb twiddling. And then we had nonprofits who, this is the biggest, I think, learning area that we've seen as local funders, that I've deemed the Alice NPOs. Nonprofits who themselves were living and operating at that Alice threshold. They weren't set up to be able to mitigate such a significant crises like a pandemic. So how did our community respond? Overall, we responded really, really well for those frontline NPOs. And Mary Kay and I knew that was going to be the case way back in early March. I remember almost word for word our phone calls to each other in early March that said, we need to join together and create a fund, because our community is so philanthropic that they know families are going to start to struggle more than they ever have before, and they're going to be looking for a central trusted place to give. And so that's when we launched the La Crosse Area Emergency Response Fund. And over in the first 6 weeks, just 6 weeks, over $1 million was given just from La Crosse County folks to help build that fund. Mary Kay and other representatives from our organizations met every weekday for months, reviewing applications and paying grant awards out to organizations who were changing their service delivery models to continue to meet the needs of their clients. So a perfect example of a frontline NPO is Coulee Cap, and the financial assistance program that Hetty was talking about that was able to help Jana and others like Jana to subsidize what was available through those government assistance programs. And so we've awarded over $1 million in grants to those frontline orgs. There's still money available in that pot. Just a plug, I know many of the folks on the Zoom meeting today are board members and strong supporters of nonprofits or volunteers at nonprofits. So if you're a nonprofit who needs help, go to our website and look up funding opportunities because they're available. And then on the far left or right side, we have those ALICE NPOs. So nonprofits who aren't necessarily providing those direct services to help meet basic needs, but they're still an incredible, vital part of our culture here in La Crosse, why so many of us choose to call La Crosse County home. It's a part of our daily lives. We want all of those nonprofits who many of us have supported ongoing through our charitable gifts to survive beyond the pandemic. And that's when the La Crosse Community Foundation ourselves as a nonprofit pivoted to our usual competitive grant making program to start doing unrestricted requests, just to help those organizations who were often place-based, relied on people having to gather ticket sales to get their revenue. And so you can see there the amount that's been requested. We've had 2 rounds of those emergency survival grant requests, and those will continue at least for the first 2 rounds in 2021 too. So let's dig into this continuum a little bit further. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So what did we, looking at the next layer down, what did we learn about our nonprofit sector here? And it can all be attributed to, were nonprofits able to pivot or not? All of us in our own personal lives had to pivot. We had to learn how to work from home. If we had kids or other generations living in our household, we were now figuring out how to do our jobs from home, be teachers to our children who are virtual learning. Just the amount of pivoting we all had to do is incredible. And the frontline organizations who were here and were functioning and meeting those needs, like Coulee Cap, Wafer, Hunger Task Force, Salvation Army, they were able to pivot exceptionally well. And that all comes down to the staunch support they have from their donors, the incredible board members who had to start working and have really tough conversations around quick changes that needed to be made to stay relevant and to meet the needs of their clients in new ways. But orgs that weren't operating on the front lines, orgs that we still wanted to see past this pandemic, weren't as fortunate. So a good example of a dormant NPO would be the Children's Museum, and they've been very transparent about this. Again, they're a place-based organization. They need the museum themselves to be open to provide their mission. And so they had to make the tough decision to cut their expenses because their revenue streams had dried up or shrink significantly for a period of time. Then we have those ALICE NPOs. And for a lot of those organizations, they didn't even have or don't have the opportunity to say, if we found a new way to do our mission for this transition in time or for this period of time, do we even have the resources and the infrastructure available to us to pivot? And remember, just like for-profit businesses, the nonprofit sectors aren't just here to deliver their missions. They make up 12% of our workforce here in Wisconsin. So they're employers too. They're trying to figure out how to continue to deliver their mission, serve their clients, but also maintain their own employees so that they don't need to become in similar situations to what Gina and others had experienced. So remember, nonprofits, unlike for-profit organizations, don't operate with a profit motive. They're not set up to deliver their mission as cheaply as possible to make a profit. They're set up to maximize their revenue, to be able to meet their mission as with the most impact as possible. So it was a really, really challenging and quick shift that a lot of nonprofits and board of directors had to figure out and had to do. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So why did we end up with so many, what I'm naming now, ALICE NPOs? And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the three of us, again, as we put this presentation together, thought, you know, we think it's worthwhile to bring it up, because this is one of those things that, as Hetty said, now is the time to address these kinds of issues for good. And one of those is just some donor education around this nonprofit organization starvation cycle. So somewhere along the lines, funders have gotten, and La Crosse Community Foundation has been a part of this, this challenge too. We've gotten this idea that nonprofit organizations must have super, super, super small overhead expenses. And that pressure, that ongoing pressure, creates this vicious cycle and underinvestment in themselves that really make their organization efficient and successful and able to have the most mission impact as possible. So as a result, we had a lot of nonprofits, again, pre-pandemic, who were already falling behind. Then we enter this crisis, right? So go ahead and go to the next slide. So the reality really is, we need to remember complex issues can't be solved on the cheap. If these issues were easy to solve, they'd already be solved. If big issues could be solved inexpensively, they'd already be solved. We rely on our nonprofit community in our society to really be addressing some of the most complicated social challenges of our existence, but yet we have this idea that they need to do it on the cheap and that they can't have a healthy infrastructure to be able to do those things well. So just remember that just like a for-profit business, a successful nonprofit needs the ability to recruit and retain quality staff. So much of a nonprofit's mission effectiveness comes down to the people who deliver those services. They need to be able to have current software and IT support, especially in this modern world. It's hard for all of us to keep up. They need to have the ability to save for cash flow challenges or other emergencies. They need resources for ongoing training so that staff can continue to learn how to do their jobs better. And they need money to be able to pay for facilities with things that they're not embarrassed of. I joke that a lot of nonprofits are used to just operating with hand-me-downs. But I think all of us want to go to work and feel good about where we work and what we do, and valued as people who choose to work in nonprofits, in the nonprofit sector, to really help with these really complex issues. So here's where we turn back to the good. The good news is our community cares. We have an incredible nonprofit community here in La Crosse County who is really committed to their missions. And I think it goes back to one of my slides earlier and examples that I shared around those especially frontline organizations who pivoted exceptionally well to continue to do their work. Thank you. I just got the 10-minute warning. You know, and I could be on here for hours giving you incredible examples of organizations who had to shift their work, you know, from one day to the next to continue to meet the needs of their clients. And they did those things, and they were able to do that because of the trust and the interest that our general public has in supporting our nonprofit community. So the good news is you know, going back to Jana's story and the reality around how many ALICE households that we have in our community, our community here really is in a much better place than a lot of other communities across our country because of the culture of philanthropy that we have here. And so thank you for that. Last slide. So where do we go from here? And, you know, we wanted to end with just one wrap-up statement from each of us individually of what is the one thing that we want all of you to take away from each of our pieces of the presentation. So Mary, we go back to Mary Kay first.
So I think, you know, we need to come together to make systemic changes. This isn't a one-hit solve. These are things that we can back up and say, how do we stop this from happening again? Not the pandemic, although we're working on that too, but how do we stop the economic difficulty for those that are a one issue away from falling into poverty?
And I would say we all want to live in a community where every single one of us has a job that pays us enough to be able to afford the basic costs of living, where we have a living wage job, we make enough money to afford health care, housing, food, and our family can achieve. And if we do get sick, we can take time off without it putting us into debt, and we can do what we need to do to be safe. So like Mary Kay, let's work together as a community now so that we can make these changes so that in the next pandemic or whatever emergencies come in the future, we are already ready and more resilient as a community.
Yeah, and we'd have a really even more strong nonprofit community that has the resources and trust to continue to innovate and be able to build its own cash reserves when emergencies and crises like a pandemic come up. All right.
Thank you all very much for sharing that. We have a few minutes left here for questions, and we've had some good commentary shared online. One of the early commenters was somebody from Habitat for Humanity who was just basically echoing some of the things that have been said, and say they, you know, especially regarding the Alice and how hard it is to make ends meet. They hear that from their homeowners and hopeful homeowners quite often. Vicki asked or noted that there are many jobs that do pay above minimum wage, like Quick Trip at $22 an hour and Target at $15 an hour, and wondered what the challenges are for people like Jana or others who are struggling that you know, keep them from applying for or getting those kinds of jobs. Is there a, you know, a time crush issue, or how do we help to make that possible for them?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think a lot of, you know, we get this a lot, like, well, you know, there are, because you see a lot of help wanted signs a lot, you know, around the area, because employers are also looking for workers as well. And a lot of the people that we work with are looking for other jobs, or they might. They're also trying to just get by. When you're trying to help your kids with school, you are trying, you know, you're hoping, you want to stay with your employer. You know, a lot of workers, we have loyalty to our employers. We are told by our employers that we're going to try to get you back. You want to, you enjoy your place of work. You want to stay with your employer. And Jana's situation is a perfect example. She worked full-time. She had a job that she liked. If she can go back to full-time, she'd prefer that. And as workers are trying to navigate life, you know, figuring out what they need to do to make ends meet day after day after day, it's really, really challenging for them to add a job search on top of that and knowing where to go to for help. So every situation is very different. It also assumes that the vacant jobs that are available match the skill set, ability, educational requirements people who are looking have. I hear that a lot too. It's like, well, there's so many jobs out there, but that assumes, like for example, the construction industry, the building industry has a lot of vacancies. There's a job shortage, but a lot of the workers we encounter do not have that type of experience or the experience that would qualify for those types of jobs. So there's a lot of assumptions built into that, and there's a lot of barriers for people accessing higher wage jobs.
Okay, thank you. A follow-up question to that, and probably not so much a question as just an observation, is that you know, many of these people were living on the edge beforehand. Now they've accumulated debts. Even if they go back to, you know, they're lucky enough, fortunate enough, able to get a full-time job with a salary that helps them, you know, hit that ALICE level. How do people ever get out of that debt cycle?
It's a great point too, because you know, we also know that we hear a lot in the news about the eviction moratorium. You know, we have an eviction moratorium in place. People can take advantage of where they're not allowed to be evicted, depending on the situation, because of COVID right now. But that does not mean that they're still not on the hook for rent. So when that eviction moratorium is lifted, any back rent that they have not paid during that time period, they will still be responsible for. So no matter how much you make, I make a living wage job, or I make a living wage. If I were months and months behind on my rent or mortgage, there would be no way I would easily be able to get caught up. So it's a huge problem if we're not helping people succeed along the way. No amount of moratorium will help people in that situation.
Okay. Jennifer asks if there are NPOs in our area, nonprofit organizations, who've had to close permanently because of the pandemic.
I don't have a definitive answer to that, but my gut would say yes. We have per capita, La Crosse County, compared to other states, has the highest amount of nonprofits as any other county. And again, I think that's a true testament to the incredible culture of philanthropy that we know exists here in La Crosse County. So yes, there are organizations that definitely won't survive.
Right. And someone also, a couple of people commented on your reflection that nonprofit organizations have been squeezed as people try to push that efficiency, and wondered how many nonprofit employees actually fall into that ALICE category.
Yes, somebody brought that up because I missed that in my notes. Is a lot of people who choose to work in the nonprofit sector, most live at that ALICE threshold or below.
And I would wholeheartedly agree. That is a situation that happens countless times.
I know a question that gets asked often regards minimum wage and the discussions about raising it. You know, there are some concerns that if we raise the minimum wage, it becomes difficult for employers to employ people, or if we raise the minimum wage, then people kind of have less incentive to start working on climbing up the jobs ladder. What kind of responses would you guys have to that?
Well, the first thing I would say is that 29 other states have raised their minimum wage, including most of the states right around Wisconsin. So by not raising our minimum wage, it puts us at a disadvantage if we're trying to attract our workforce. And we need to attract our workforce. A significant number of our population is aging in Wisconsin. We need to bring younger workers here in order to fill jobs. And so this is a competitive advantage first and foremost. But in terms of incentivizing people want to work. I do not encounter people that don't want to work. And the more that we can help people earn a living wage where they can afford expenses, that's money that they're pouring right back into their economy. They're paying landlords, they're paying for expenses, they're buying things in their local economy, and that's going to drive the economy further, help small businesses, help help schools, help people pay their taxes and reinvest in their community. So by helping people pay their bills and make sure they can afford the cost of living, it helps the entire community.
Yep, thank you. I was reflecting, you know, you're talking about the constellation of nonprofits in the area and how blessed we are, and we truly are. I happen to serve on the Rotary Works Board, which is, you know, yet another one of those that's a pot of money that is out there doing good in the community and funding various projects or assisting to fund them. Churches are another often overlooked contributor to helping people out, and of course churches are all over the map and what they do and how they're able to do it. I know that our congregation a few years ago did a study of the value that we offer back to the community, and in terms of the food that we donate to pantries, the meals that we serve, the educational and youth programming on an annual basis, we're putting about $200,000 worth of value back into the community. And this is, my congregation is not a particularly large one, but I also know from talking with other churches, we're in the same pinch as the businesses and the nonprofits and everybody else. So we're basically at our time limit. Any final words or words of hope, or what can we do as a community to try to move our way forward here?
I'll just say this. The numbers don't lie, but they are just numbers. And when it comes right down to it, we all touch each other. We're all a part of the community. And if we have a weak section of our community, we have a weak community. So if we all touch each other, then we all need to come together to find the solutions to bring people up. You can talk about GDP and you can talk about putting money back in the economy, but really it's about humans, helping humans, in whatever capacity that can happen.
Yep, thank you. Jamie or Hetty, anything that you'd like to add?
I'll add, just if you have the financial means to give right now, now is the time to give. The fallout from the pandemic is nowhere near done. We're going to continue to need to support our nonprofit community in the ways that we implemented in 2020. And, you know, we've spent $1 million in 10 months in 2020. That fund, the Emergency Response Fund, now only has $51,000 in it. Requests are going to start coming in again as the last round of stimulus money runs out. So, you know, just please choose to continue to support your neighbors if you're in a position to do so.
Amen.
And I would add to that, this is a pivotal time in our country as well. There's many policies are being considered that will carry our country forward and how we serve people. And so please don't be afraid to engage with your lawmakers and tell them how you would like to create systemic changes so that people can succeed in our community. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all very, very much. This has been eye-opening. I did not ask earlier, would it be okay for us to take the PowerPoint and make it available on the Interfaith Leaders page if people want to go back and look at those numbers? Okay. For those who are watching, I'm not sure how long it'll take us to do that, but if you check it in the next day or two, we probably will have that available for you. And just a reminder to come back and check in February for our next community conversation when we're going to be talking about connecting and the ways that we can work on those interpersonal connections and share stories and just encourage each other as we continue to work our way through this time of COVID. So thank you all very much. Blessings and have a wonderful day.